This is the untold story of the making of the modern world. A fresh perspective, charting the spread of civilization across the globe. From the dawn of mankind and the first cities and empires, to the belief in one God. We follow the flow of civilization from the Middle East, an extraordinary place that has been a vital link between the continents of Asia, Africa, and Europe for millennia. An economic, scientific, and cultural center of the world. This is an epic journey of discovery. From the east to the west. Mecca, the holiest city in the Islamic world. According to Muslim tradition, this is the city where the Prophet Mohammed was born, the city where he first received God's message, the city which gave birth to Islam. For over 1,400 years, no non-Muslim has been allowed to enter Mecca. While it's been the duty of every able-bodied follower to pilgrimage here and pay homage to God once in their lifetime, performing the Hajj, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. In the last month of the Islamic calendar, over 3 million Muslims still perform this pilgrimage each year, worshipping around the Kaaba, the black stone which marks the Muslim direction of prayer. In the 21st century, Islam is the fastest growing religion on earth. Over 1.5 billion people, 23% of the world's population, following the words of the Prophet Mohammed. This is the story of the events that began this amazing global following. Exploring the cultural heritage of its first converts, the nomadic Arab tribes, who before Islam had conquered the desert, but had yet to change the wider world. Under Islam, they were united under one banner, transforming not just the Middle East, but the rest of the globe, forever. Every year during the Hajj, pilgrims make an extra journey to the outskirts of Mecca to climb Mount Nur, following the footsteps of their Prophet Mohammed.
إنما جاء النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم عمره في 40 سنة في رمضان 27 ليلة القدر. هذا المكان مرتفع ويشوف مكة من فوق، من ذروة قمة. بسبب هذا هو كان يشوف أحوال المجتمع ويفكر فيه ويعبد الله سبحانه وتعالى، وبهذا الشكل حتى وصل إلى 40 سنة.
According to Muslim tradition, for the first 40 years of his life, the Prophet Muhammad, then simply a merchant citizen of Mecca, made the journey here to reflect and escape, disenchanted by the sinful lifestyle of the urban populace below. And it was here, 1,400 years ago, that his piety was rewarded when God first revealed his message to him, an event that would change the world forever.
هذا الغار هيرة الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يتعبد هنا نزل الوحي نزل جبريل ونزل مع وحي.
As he rested on top of the mountain, the angel Gabriel appeared to him 3 times, instructing the Prophet to recite the following words.
اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم كلا.
With this revelation, the call to Islam had begun, the first of many which the Prophet Muhammad would receive throughout his life. Revelations that would become the basis of the holiest book of Islam, the Quran. It was following this revelation that the Prophet Muhammad began his mission to spread the word of Islam, sowing the seeds that would bring the Arab tribes together under one banner for the first time ever. 1400 years ago, they were united under a new religion, Islam. For the first time, this gave them the opportunity and drive to become a global power. This incident is one of the most momentous in the history of world religion, an event that would begin to transform the cultural makeup of the Arabian Peninsula forever. Before Islam, for thousands of years, the native inhabitants of this desert region, the Arabs, had lived as separate groups of nomads, governed by tribal rules and laws.
The first time the Arabs appear in any sort of historical record is in the victory inscriptions of the Assyrian kings. The Assyrian kings are the great warrior kings of northern Iraq from about 1000 BC onwards. And the great thing about the Assyrians was that they put up monuments and they wrote about what they'd been doing in this cuneiform writing that we see here. And in this one, Shalmaneser III, in about 850 BC, is writing about his conquests, and he's writing about his allies and the people who fought with him. And one of these is called Gindibu the Arab, named as such, with 1,000 of his followers. We don't know anything more than that about them, but this is the first time the name Arab appears in the historical record. If we go on about 100 years, we actually get the first visual images of Arabs to be found anywhere. This is part of a frieze. It dates from 728 BC, and it depicts a triumphant procession of prisoners. This time the Arabs are on the wrong side. And here are the Arab prisoners, definitely prisoners. They've only got little sort of skirts on. They've been stripped of their clothes. They're bearded. They've got long hair. All these things are probably accurate. And look at the way they've got their wrists tied behind their backs. These people are not having a good time. And here, on the lower evidence, we see the sort of things that the Assyrians were taking from these Arabs. And the first thing are the camels. The classic one-humped camels of the desert that you still see today. And this is the chief sort of booty that the Arabs have to offer. And it's interesting, of course, what the Arabs are contributing is their livestock. There is no mention here of fine textiles. There's no mention of precious gold and silver or anything like that. And there are no representations of any buildings and castles. They offer the simple products of a pastoral lifestyle.
And even today, nomadic Bedouin tribes still inhabit the desert, living a remarkably similar lifestyle to their ancient Arab forefathers.
هم البدو لأن الإنسان مثل ما عاش من أول إحنا عشنا في الصحراء وهيك عايشين نفس طبيعة آبائنا وأجدادنا، عندنا نفسيتنا نفس نفسيتهم لنا. أعتز فيها وأفتخر بها هذه العيشة، وما في يعني ما تخاف إن لأنك تحافظ على كرامتك وعلى عيشتك وعلى أرضك وعلى عرضك في حياة البدو.
Although it wasn't until the birth of Islam that the Arab tribes began to establish a unified culture and make a global impact, this tribal way of life, traveling in small nomadic groups, bonded by tribal laws and loyalties, had enabled them not only to survive, but to flourish on the limited resources which the desert offered.
The desert looks to us to be incredibly harsh and inhospitable, but properly managed by people who knew what they were doing, it could be a land of opportunity. Caravans could be organized to go through the desert, passing from one tribal territory to another, and to bring profit to the people who organize them. So it was a land of economic opportunity.
For thousands of years before Arab Muslims began to expand their territorial domain, the Arabian Desert was already a key trade route between East and West. The region was perfectly placed to profit from the passage of goods between India, China, Arabia, and Europe. It gave rise to one of the most remarkable cities of the ancient world, on the edge of the Arabian Desert, Petra. Today, Petra's ruins give us a glimpse of how the Arabs began to capitalize on these lucrative trade opportunities and reveal their early attempts to create an enduring civilization.
What makes Petra unique is that it combines two seemingly paradoxical characteristics. It's both hidden, ringed by this huge range of mountains that you see around you, and it's also very accessible. When you pass out to the east, one enters a narrow passage that takes you then to a junction of trade routes through which one can access markets to the north, Syria and beyond, to the east, Iraq and Iran, to the south, Yemen, and also to the west through a gap in the mountains here on to Gaza and the Mediterranean. The Nabateans, an Arab people who pastured herds of sheep and camels in the eastern deserts here, gradually took control of these trade routes.
The first records of the Nabateans date from over 2,300 years ago. Whilst they were still a nomadic tribe, they established Petra as a city for their dead, carving out over 800 tombs from the rocky ravines. But within 200 years, their fortunes would change as they accumulated vast wealth from their monopoly of the lucrative trade routes.
The Nabateans became wealthy in particular because of one product, namely incense. Frankincense is only found in Yemen. It was used very much for dedications to the deities, cremations. Famously, Nero threw 30 pounds of incense on the funeral pyre of his consort Poppaea when she died. By the time the frankincense gets to the markets of the Mediterranean, you have to pay a fortune. It's 6 gold coins for each pound of frankincense. A gold coin is something that an average person couldn't dream of earning in a whole year. The Nabateans cream off a lot of the money from this.
With the revenue, the Nabateans transformed Petra from a city of the dead into a living, bustling metropolis. And as thousands of traders from different cultures passed through the city, Petra drew on the cultural traditions of its foreign visitors. Its architecture combined Greco-Roman influences with designs from Ptolemaic Egypt and Babylonian styles from ancient Mesopotamia.
In many ways, this is the uniqueness of Petra, bringing together of different traditions and ideas from so many peoples.
The Nabateans had created a cosmopolitan society, drawing on the many cultures they encountered through trade. They were the first Arabs to establish an empire. But while their nomadic culture had enabled them to conquer the desert, they would never conquer the wider world. Despite their riches, the Nabateans were never the masters, always the servants. Theirs was a commercial empire, and in terms of politics and power, they were never fully in control. 1,900 years ago, the Roman Empire spread east and gained control of the region. The Nabateans' fate was totally in their hands. So when the Romans redirected the trade routes away from Petra, the Nabatean glory days were over. But their demise didn't crush the Arabs completely. As the new trade route wound its way through the desert, another tribe took control of the commerce. With the wealth it brought them, they not only created a new, equally lavish kingdom, but this time, one with real ambitions of power. Palmyra. Like Petra, Palmyra grew into a thriving metropolis with theatres and colonnades influenced by the classical world which it had encountered through trade. For the first time in history, the world would get a brief glimpse of a real Arab empire. Superficially, it looks Greek and Roman like Petra before it. But Palmyra retained its distinctly Arab and Eastern identity, revealed by the huge temple complex at its heart. Not a temple to Greek or Roman gods, but to the ancient Arabic god, Baal, the god of the sun.
ولكن في الزخارف في التفاصيل نجد الواجهات كلها كلاسيكية، ولكن في الداخل والطقوس في الداخل هي شرقية. ممكن هنا أن نلاحظ هذا السقف المزخرف بشكل معجز وكأنه على الخشب، بينما هو قطعة حجرية واحدة توازي أكثر من 30 طن. في الوسط الشمس وهي رمز للإله بعل، يعني رمز الوجود في العالم، هي الضياء وهي البركة وهي الخير. حواليها نفسه ما نسميه الأرابيسك اليوم، الخطوط هاي المتقاطعة. كملوا بعد ما صارت تدمر هي عاصمة التجارة في العالم كله، في العالم كله. وبعدها أن أنهى الرومان البتراء، أصبحت طرق التجارة كلها لا تدمر، وخيرات التجارة العالمية كلها تصب في خزائن التدمرين. فنشأت طبقة أرستقراطية تجارية غنية جدا في العالم، أنشأت هذه المنشآت أو كملت هذه المنشآت الغريبة.
Palmyra had entered a golden age, and driven by its queen Zenobia, it had dreams of becoming an empire to rival Rome itself. But Zenobia underestimated both Rome's determination to control trade and the strength of its legions. The Roman forces invaded the city and took Zenobia back to Rome, where they paraded her as a symbol of their victory.
عندما سمعت هي بهذا النهاية المؤلمة لشعبها ومدينتها، تناولت السم من خاتمها الذي كان بيدها وماتت.
Palmyra lay in ruins. Its days as a thriving trade center had ended. At both Petra and Palmyra, the Arabs had proved that they could create great kingdoms off the back of trade through the desert. But in both cases, they had failed to make a lasting impact. And it would be another 300 years before the Arabs' fortunes would begin to change forever. At another city on the caravan route, Mecca. Following the revelation of God here, the Prophet Mohammed began his mission to spread the word of Islam, sowing the seed that would unite all the Arab tribes. And the Quran created further unity with a strict set of doctrinal rules governing every aspect of Muslim lives and giving them a common goal. At its heart are the 5 pillars of Islam.
الحمد لله. أركان الإسلام هي 5: أن تشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأن محمدًا عبده ورسوله، ثم إقام الصلاة، ثم إيتاء الزكاة، ثم صوم رمضان، ثم حج البيت لمن استطاع إليه سبيلا. هذه أركان الإسلام 5.
By 630, Islam had gathered together over 10,000 followers, but this was only the beginnings of what would shortly become a vast global following.
Her ne kadar Kur'an Arap diliyle inmiş ise de ama bu Araplara mahsus bir şey değildi. Bütün insanlığa ulaştırılması gerekiyordu. Böyle olduğu için her Müslüman kendini bununla sorumlu hissetti ve İslamiyet'i başkalarına anlatabilmek, bu Tanrı'nın mesajını başkalarına ulaştırabilmek için her yolu denemeye çalıştılar.
The desire to spread God's message was central to this burgeoning religion. It was this that would help fuel the early expansion of the Muslim empire. Just 2 years after the death of the Prophet Mohammed, this desire resulted in the Arab Muslims' first major victory, the taking of Damascus. The manner in which they won over both the city and its citizens would set the style for Islam's spread over the next 100 years. Damascus is said to be the oldest continuously occupied city in the world. Its busy souk reflects its origins as a thriving center of commerce, the terminus of trade with Mecca, linking the Far East with the Christian Byzantine West.
Damascus was the emporium, the rich city in the minds of the Arabs. And conquering Damascus was probably a symbolic act in terms of conquering Syria.
In 634, the Muslim army arrived at the city's gates. But taking this ancient capital would be no mean feat. Only 12 years after the birth of the Islamic State, the Arab Muslim force was still in its infancy. Yet it was about to be pitted against a force that had dominated the ancient world for over 800 years.
We know that the Arabic army that came into Syria was made up of 12,000 soldiers, ill-equipped, not having enough horses, not having enough swords.
The Arabs not only faced a formidable Byzantine army, but one entrenched in a heavily fortified city. With the odds stacked against them, their generals were split on how to take the city, either by the sword or through negotiation. The military approach was personified by Khalid ibn al-Walid, a warrior whose fearsome reputation in battle had already gained him the title, the Sword of Islam. He began to lay siege to the Eastern Gate.
And Khalid ibn al-Walid is a man of action, is really the very famous hero of the Islamic armies in the early years of the conquest. And he and his division were here at the Eastern Gate of the city of Damascus. Khalid ibn al-Walid was very keen on conquering the city with his sword.
But while Khalid ibn al-Walid was spoiling for a fight at the eastern gate of the city, at the opposite gate his fellow general, Abu Ubayd al-Jarrah, had different plans.
Abu Ubayd al-Jarrah entered into negotiations on the other end, probably with the Patriarch of Damascus, and ultimately signed a treaty or a truce whereby the army was let into the city peacefully from the western gate of the city. And the story goes that half of Damascus was conquered by war and the other half was conquered by peace.
The ancient city that had been under the dominion of the most powerful force in the West was now ruled from the east by the east. The old order was gone, and the balance of power had shifted. Damascus had become home to a new form of government that would change the world. Remarkably, although spreading Islam was a prime motivation for territorial growth, the new Islamic rulers didn't simply impose their beliefs on the city's inhabitants, most of whom were Christians. There's evidence for this in the history of one of the city's oldest religious buildings.
نحن على هذه القطعة من الأرض كان هناك السوق الذي يحيط في المعبد اللي هو المعبد المقدس، وداخل المعبد كان هناك قدس الأقداس أو السلة أو المذبح. هذا الجدار الذي يمثل والذي نراه هنا يمثل جدار التيمينوس، جدار المعبد الروماني اليوناني الأصلي. لم يتغير هذا الجدار، ومحيط هذا الجدار أيضا لم يتغير، وإنما تغير استعماله من معبد روماني إلى كنيسة بيزنطية.
But when the Muslims conquered the city in the 7th century, they didn't take over the church immediately and build the Umayyad mosque we see today. For many decades after the conquest, it remained a church too. Amazingly, the Muslims decided to share it with the Christians.
فكان الجامعة في الجهة الشرقية، وكان الكنيسة في الجهة الغربية، وكان المواطنون الدمشقيون يدخلون من البوابة الجنوبية، يذهب إلى المسلمون إلى جامعهم والمسيحيون إلى هذه الكنيسة، وبقي الحال على ذلك حوالي 70 عام.
Religious and cultural tolerance, as well as military strength, had characterized the Arab-Muslim conquest of Damascus, and it would continue to do so as they maintained their expansion. Even when they set their sights on another city of major importance in the region. It was a place of little strategic value, but of huge religious significance for every faith group in the region, including the new Islamic State, Jerusalem. According to Islamic tradition, this was where the Prophet Mohammed was taken on the night journey by the angel Gabriel, where he led the other prophets in prayer and met with God. Jerusalem was the Muslims' third holiest city, after Mecca and Medina.
The night journey in itself is important in Muslim practice and belief, because at that night, Prophet Muhammad, according to Muslim point of views, performed a prayer. He was the Imam, the leader of all the prominent prophets like Isaac, Abraham, Jesus, Moses.
But at the beginning of the 7th century, Jerusalem, like Damascus, was ruled by the Byzantines. As Christians, they considered it to be their holiest of cities, at its sacred heart, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
We are in front of the Holy Sepulchre, and according to Christianity, Jesus Christ was crucified and buried here, inside here, in the middle of Jerusalem.
Just 3 years after the fall of Damascus, in 637, the Arab Muslim forces arrived at the city's walls. And as the Byzantine forces had already been routed from Damascus, Jerusalem couldn't rely on any military backup. Although Jerusalem held out for 4 months, its ruler, the Patriarch Sophronius, knew that his city's fate was sealed and decided to surrender. Sophronius had taken a huge gamble. What would happen to the Christians' most important city once it was claimed by a force who also held it so sacred?
Umar ibn al-Khattab came to the Holy Sepulchre because the Patriarch wanted to show him the church. Then it was the time for Muslim prayer, and he wanted to pray, so the Patriarch asked him to pray inside the church, and he refused. he refused because he told him that in the future, the Muslims will start saying that Umar ibn al-Khattab prayed here, and then they will claim the place and they will change the church to mosque.
Recognizing the importance of the church to Christians, the Muslim leader, the Caliph Omar, decided to find another location to pray. Finding his own place of worship within just a few meters of the Holy Sepulchre, establishing the mosque that today bears his name. The Muslims were now in possession of one of their holiest cities, and they could set about celebrating the location where the Prophet Mohammed was taken on the night journey, today marked by the oldest surviving Islamic monument in the world, the Dome of the Rock.
When ordinary Muslim visit the Dome of the Rock, the first act they will do a prayer following the steps of Prophet Muhammad. So that really is so important in Islamic creed and Islamic belief.
After the conquest of Jerusalem, the Christians were again allowed to keep their churches, and the Jews, who under the Romans and Byzantines had been banished from the city for centuries, were now allowed to return. Religious tolerance was core to Islamic belief, but it was also key to the future success of the empire. Acceptance into the new Islamic state came at a price. In return for protection, non-Muslims, such as Christians and Jews, had to pay a poll tax. The taxes gained through conquest not only ensured that the empire could continue to grow, but that it would have the financial wealth to last. And like the development of every empire in history, the direction of expansion was very much motivated by the potential riches on offer. Nowhere in the world offering greater rewards than their next conquest, Egypt, the breadbasket of the region. In 639, the Arab Muslim forces arrived in the country. The speed of their advance was amazing. They quickly gained control of the Nile, overcoming its heavily guarded defenses, before advancing on its capital, Alexandria. This was the port which had been the main hub between East and West for over 1,000 years. Within 2 years, Egypt was completely under Arab Muslim control, the Byzantines banished from the region forever. The Islamic State now set out to maximize the riches it could gain from the country. One of the first buildings they made wasn't dedicated to religion. It was designed to calculate tax and therefore fund their empire.
This is the Nilometer, and this is probably the oldest Islamic building in Egypt. The Nilometer is the device that measures the water of the Nile. Every year the Nile used to flood. The water would come in from this hole there, and the space that we're standing in would be filled up. And the column has all these measurements. The unit of these measurements is the cubit. So every cubit, you can see there's a section there, and people would be recording this all the time. And this has to be monitored every day, because it should always be compared with the year before and the years before. If it gives you good Niles, good level, then everything will be okay. You'll have good irrigation, you'll have good crops, you'll sell well, you'll do good business. People will pay taxes, no problems.
By monitoring the levels of the Nile, the Islamic State could evaluate each year's potential harvest, and therefore how much they could tax the population, maximizing their financial rewards. Because this wasn't a smash-and-grab raid. The Islamic State wanted to create a lasting empire and make sure that Egypt would become the jewel in that empire's crown forever. The Arab Muslim army, who were still mostly nomadic tribesmen, now had to settle down to make sure their presence was permanent. And a few hundred meters from the site of their first victory, archaeologists have discovered evidence of the Muslims' very first settlement in Egypt.
These brick buildings are the remains of the houses of the earliest Islamic settlement in this area called Fustat. This was originally the site where the Arab army was based and probably where their camp was. And these garrison towns are a kind of making permanent of the army military camp. One of the first things that was done was the foundation of the new congregational mosque. This was the key place for the bonding and the communal interaction of this new religious community. The rest of the city was laid out by means of plots of land which were given to the different tribal units, and they were allowed then to build up their own areas of settlement, their own facilities, their houses. Smaller neighbourhood mosques perhaps were built up around within each of these plots to serve the needs of each individual tribe who settled in Fustat. Basically, the whole of Fustat is a new settlement. It didn't take over any pre-existing settlements. There was nothing here before, and that's a very unusual development in the history of urbanism.
The Arab Muslim forces had built a totally new capital, completely from scratch. And what started off as a small settlement, Fustat, would eventually become Cairo, today the biggest Arab city in the world. The city of 1,000 minarets, with a predominantly Muslim population of around 15 million people. As the Muslims' territories grew, new distinctly Arab Islamic towns began to evolve. Baghdad, Basra, Mosul, Fustat, and Qayrawan, reshaping the landscape of Arabia and North Africa completely. Even today, the layout of towns like Fez in Morocco still reflect the character and culture of its early nomadic settlers.
Fez captures the very essence of what is an Islamic city. When the city was first built, it was organized into a number of neighborhoods, and usually there are a number of things or a number of reasons behind this organization. I would think tribal, ethnic, or even religious affiliation. Each neighborhood is self-sufficient in terms of all its basic needs. For example, there is a fountain, usually used for the population of the neighborhood to fetch their water. But this is also an act of piety, to provide water for passers-by. It would have a mosque Usually the mosque in the neighborhood is smaller than the major mosque in the heart of the city because it is used for the 5 daily prayers. And usually on Friday, the people of the neighborhood would have to go to the main mosque of the city. Kutab, which is basically a place for learning for children, to teach them the very basic of religion. A number of shops, but when I speak of shops, I'm talking mostly about basic needs, like convenience stores. Usually each neighborhood would have an oven for baking the bread of the neighborhood.
These structured neighborhood units were the core of the new cities which sprang up across the Islamic Empire. The labyrinthine maze of streets that linked them together was quite different from the open gridded city planning of the classical world that had gone before. The urban landscape of the Middle East and North Africa was changing forever. By the late 7th century, the Islamic Empire covered vast territories, and it was now that their rulers began to make a conscious effort to create a single imperial identity that would be needed to ensure a lasting civilization. One of the first things they did was to unify the language. Arabic had always been the language of Islam, but at first it wasn't used as the language of administration, and each of the conquered territories were administered in their local tongue. Now, Arabic became the official language of the empire. As a consequence, today, it is spoken by over 280 million people.
وألهنها وحصينها وحرزها.
Only 60 years since the birth of Islam, the Islamic State had spread its own language, culture, and architecture over a huge area, stretching from Persia right through North Africa. And now the Umayyad rulers created the ultimate symbol of their far-reaching power, the first imperial mosque.
إلى أن أتى عهد الوليد واتسعت الإمبراطورية الإسلامية من الأطلسي إلى الصين وأصبحت دمشق عاصمة كبرى وكثر المسلمون في دمشق وكان هناك حاجة ماسة لبناء منشأة ضخمة جدا تعبر ليس فقط عن القيمة الدينية وإنما عن القيمة الحكومية والرمزية وسلطة الدولة وكل ما شابه.
The Muslims stopped sharing the building with other worshippers. Christians were given an alternative place to pray, and this ancient religious site was transformed into the mosque we see today.
وكان لابد من إقامة هذا المبنى وأتى هذا المبنى مفخرة العصور وشكل بروتوتايب اللي هو نموذج تكرر في كل جوامع العالم الإسلامي وخاصة من بلاد الشام إلى شمال أفريقيا إلى الأندلس.
The architecture and layout of the Byzantine church had formed the basis of the first ever imperial mosque. Even the decoration on its walls was inspired by the Byzantines. But the architects had also created something totally new, a model for all future great mosques. A grand courtyard where worshippers could gather, fountains where they could wash before prayer, and prayer halls focused on the mihrab, the niche denoting the direction of worship towards Mecca. Architects and craftsmen from across the empire were instructed to visit so that they could copy the design. Further mosques began to spring up, built not just as places of worship, but as lasting symbols of the Islamic Empire. By the early 8th century, the empire now covered the whole of the Middle East and North Africa, and it was about to spread even further west. Just 8 miles off the coast of Morocco, across the Straits of Gibraltar, lay a whole new frontier for the Islamic army: Spain. Like Egypt before, Spain's fertile lands offered a new opportunity to amass wealth for the Islamic Empire. And it was in a state of political turmoil. In fact, it was ripe for the picking.
Spain at this stage was suffering what seems to have been a short-term political crisis, but a political crisis nonetheless. And the King Vititza had died, and there was a struggle for succession. And this seems to have been one of the reasons why Spain performed so badly when faced with what was probably a much smaller number of Muslim troops.
In 711, the Muslim army conquered southern Spain, and the Umayyad Caliphate set up their capital at Córdoba, in the new province they called Al-Andalus. They now set about stamping their identity on the West, building an imperial mosque as magnificent as any they'd created in the East.
This mosque is a mixture of the Damascus Great Mosque, the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, as well as the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, not only in plan, but as well as in elevation.
But the similarities to the great imperial mosques of the East weren't just structural, they were also in the details. The walls of the magnificent edifice were covered with glittering mosaics, taking their inspiration from designs originating in the Great Mosque in Damascus.
The decoration of the first part of the mosque is very scarce, but it is not preserved, of course. But what is preserved are the columns of the mosque. This authentic forest of columns.
The effect of this Islamic monument on the Spanish population was so profound that even when Spain became Christian again, 500 years later, the new Christian rulers chose not to destroy the Islamic presence completely, but instead build their cathedral right in the heart of the mosque.
Instead of demolishing the mosque, the cathedral was established in the middle of the mosque. The people of Córdoba didn't want the mosque to disappear because they considered the mosque the symbol, the emblem of Córdoba. And that's how the representation of Islam became, in fact, the representation of the people of Córdoba and of Andalusia.
Islam had changed the face of the globe forever. The early Muslims had not only conquered the desert, they had conquered the East. They had not only transformed the West, they'd begun to transform the world. Arab people had sown the seeds of a religion and culture, that would touch every country and every corner of the earth to this day. And in the 21st century, over 1.5 billion Muslims, 23% of the world's population, still pray towards Mecca, the birthplace of the Prophet Mohammed. The speed and ease of this expansion was remarkable. Within little more than 100 years, Islam had already spread across vast territories, creating one of the largest empires in history. An empire that was built almost overnight, but whose legacy would endure to this day.